The morning sun had barely peeked over the horizon when Flight 2317 began boarding at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. The experienced flight attendant adjusted her navy blue scarf one last time before greeting the stream of passengers making their way onto the aircraft. She'd been flying these friendly skies for over 15 years now, and each flight brought its own unique stories. As travelers filed past her with their carry-on bags and sleepy expressions, she maintained her warm smile, offering helping hands to those struggling with overhead compartments and giving extra attention to families with young children. The familiar sounds of shuffling feet, clicking seatbelts, and overhead bins snapping shut filled the cabin. The early morning flight to Seattle was nearly full, typical for a Thursday. Business travelers in pressed suits tapped away on their laptops, while vacation-goers chatted excitedly about their Pacific Northwest adventures. The flight attendant moved through her pre-flight routine with practiced ease, checking seatbelts, ensuring bags were properly stowed, and answering questions about connection times. But something caught her eye in row 14. It wasn't dramatic, just different enough from the usual patterns to stand out to someone who'd seen thousands of passengers come and go. A middle-aged man sat quietly by the window, his shoulders slightly hunched, hands folded tightly in his lap. While most passengers were either working, reading, or scrolling through their phones, this man simply stared straight ahead, lost in thought. Years of experience had taught her to notice the little things. The way he kept his jacket on despite the warm cabin temperature. How his eyes didn't quite meet hers during the safety demonstration. The slight tremor in his hand when he declined the complimentary beverage service with a barely audible "no, thank you." Other passengers might have seen nothing unusual, but she knew better. In her years of flying, she'd learned that every passenger had a story. Some were flying to job interviews, others to weddings or graduations. But occasionally, she encountered someone who seemed to carry the weight of the world on their shoulders. This passenger reminded her of why she'd chosen this career in the first place, not just to serve drinks and demonstrate safety features, but to make a difference in people's lives, even if just for a few hours at 35,000 feet. The plane pushed back from the gate right on schedule, the engines humming to life. As they taxied toward the runway, she couldn't shake the feeling that this flight would be different from the countless others she'd worked. Sometimes, she'd learned, the most meaningful moments happen when you least expect them, on what seems like just another ordinary day. Little did anyone know that this routine flight from Dallas to Seattle would become a story that would touch hearts across the country, all because one flight attendant decided to look beyond the surface and see what others might miss. As the aircraft lifted into the morning sky, no one, not the busy business people, not the excited tourists, and certainly not the quiet man in row 14, could have predicted how this journey would unfold. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their cruising altitude and the expected smooth flight conditions ahead. But while the skies might have been clear that morning, the story about to unfold would prove to be anything but ordinary. This was just the beginning of a chain of events that would remind everyone on board about the power of human kindness and the unexpected ways it can appear, even at 35,000 feet in the air. As the flight reached its cruising altitude, the morning light streaming through the windows revealed more details about the quiet passenger in row 14. His clothes, though clean, told the story of their own. The blue button-down shirt was carefully pressed but showed signs of wear at the collar. His dark slacks, while neat, had been mended carefully at one knee, the kind of repair someone makes when they're trying their best with what they have. But it wasn't just his clothing that caught the flight attendant's attention. It was the way he held himself, like someone carrying an invisible weight on his shoulders. In his weathered hands, he clutched a wrinkled envelope as if it contained something precious. Every few minutes, he would pull out his phone, check it with trembling fingers, then tuck it away again, a gesture that spoke of anxiety and uncertainty. The traces of dirt on his hands suggested recent travel, perhaps a long journey made in difficult circumstances. His face showed the kind of exhaustion that sleep alone couldn't cure, the kind that comes from wrestling with life's heaviest burdens. Dark circles rimmed his eyes, and his untrimmed beard suggested several days without proper rest. When the passenger in the aisle seat asked him to let her pass to use the restroom, he moved with an apologetic awkwardness, as if he was afraid of inconveniencing anyone. His brief smile was genuine but strained, like someone trying to maintain dignity while going through something immensely difficult. During the beverage service, the flight attendant noticed how his eyes lingered on the snack cart, though he quickly looked away when she approached. His polite decline of refreshments was contradicted by the supple sound of his stomach growling, a sound he tried to mask with a quiet cough. What struck her most wasn't what she could see, but what she could sense. Years of working with the public had given her an instinct for reading people, and everything about this passenger spoke of someone going through a personal crisis. It wasn't the obvious distress of an angry or difficult passenger; those were easy to spot. This was the quiet struggle of someone trying their very best to hold it together while their world was falling apart. The envelope he held caught her attention again. Through the worn paper, she could make out what looked like an official letterhead. Each time the plane hit a small patch of turbulence, his grip on it would tighten, as if it was his only lifeline to whatever awaited him in Seattle. Other passengers around him seemed absorbed in their own worlds, watching movies, working on laptops, or sleeping beneath their travel blankets. But the flight attendant couldn't shake the feeling that she was witnessing someone at a crucial moment in their life journey, not just their flight journey. His attempts to make himself invisible, to take up as little space as possible, only made him stand out more to her trained eye. There was a dignity in his demeanor, a quiet resolve that suggested he wasn't someone used to being in this situation. When he thought no one was looking, his expression would shift, revealing a moment of raw emotion before he quickly composed himself again. As she moved through the cabin attending to other passengers, she kept finding her attention drawn back to row 14. In all her years of flying, she'd learned that sometimes the people who needed help the most were the ones least likely to ask for it. Something told her that this passenger's story was about to unfold into something that would touch not just her heart, but the hearts of everyone on board. The drink service cart made its way slowly down the aisle, the gentle clinking of ice cubes mixing with the steady hum of the engines. The flight attendant found herself moving more deliberately as she approached row 14, taking extra care with each interaction, knowing that sometimes the smallest gestures could open the biggest doors. When she reached his row, she noticed how the passenger seemed to shrink further into his seat, as if trying to become invisible. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked, her voice gentle but cheerful. His eyes darted briefly to the array of beverages before he shook his head. "No, thank you," he whispered, his voice rough from lack of use. But 15 years of experience had taught her to notice the small things, like how his gaze lingered on the snack basket, how his hands unconsciously moved to his empty stomach. She'd seen hunger before, had witnessed the quiet dignity of those too proud or too troubled to ask for help. This was a moment that required more than just following standard service protocol. Instead of moving on, she paused, adjusting her cart slightly to create a small pocket of privacy in the busy cabin. "Our flight to Seattle is quite long," she said conversationally, arranging cups on her cart. "It's important to stay hydrated." She noticed how he glanced at his wrinkled envelope again, his knuckles white from gripping it so tightly. Years ago, during her training, a senior flight attendant had shared a valuable lesson: "We're not just serving drinks, we're serving people." Those words had shaped her entire approach to her job. Sometimes the most important part of their role wasn't following procedures, but following their instincts about when someone needed more than just a beverage service. She remembered the emergency training sessions that covered more than just evacuation procedures. They learned about recognizing signs of distress, about how air travel often caught people at their most vulnerable moments. This passenger displayed many of those signs: the isolation, the anxiety, the physical signs of exhaustion and hunger. Making a quick decision, she reached for a bottle of water and a few packets of snacks. "These are complimentary," she said, placing them on his tray table with a warm smile. The man started to protest, but she gently added, "It's airline policy to ensure our passengers' well-being." It wasn't exactly policy, but sometimes kindness needed a little cover story. The subtle shift in his expression, a mixture of gratitude and relief fighting against pride, told her she'd made the right choice. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the water bottle, and she noticed a thin tan line on his finger where a wedding ring might have once been. Other passengers continued their routine activities, watching movies, working on laptops, or dozing under thin airplane blankets. But in this small moment, something significant was happening. It wasn't just about water or snacks, it was about acknowledging someone's humanity when they felt invisible. As she prepared to move on with her cart, she noticed how he carefully arranged the snacks on his tray, as if making them last. There was something in that simple gesture that suggested a longer story, one of careful planning, of making do with less, of trying to maintain dignity in difficult circumstances. Before continuing down the aisle, she made a mental note to check back on him. Sometimes the first interaction was just the beginning, a small crack in the wall that people build around their troubles. Her instincts told her that this passenger's story wasn't fully revealed yet, and that this small moment of connection might lead to something more significant. The rest of the cabin buzzed with the usual mid-flight activity, but she carried with her a quiet certainty that this flight would be remembered not for its destination, but for the journey of human connection that was just beginning to unfold at 35,000 feet above the ground. During a quiet moment when most passengers were absorbed in their movies or dozing off, the flight attendant found an opportunity to check on the passenger in row 14. She noticed he had only eaten half of one small snack package, saving the rest with careful precision. The water bottle remained nearly full, someone used to making things last. "Mind if I sit for a moment?" she asked softly, gesturing to the empty middle seat next to him. The surrounding passengers were all asleep, creating a small bubble of privacy in the crowded cabin. He nodded, straightening up slightly, that same mix of dignity and distress evident in his posture. "I couldn't help but notice you've had a long day," she said gently, her voice barely above a whisper. It was the kind of tone that invited confidence without demanding it. The man's hands tightened around the envelope he'd been holding, and for a moment she thought he might retreat back into silence. But sometimes, when someone shows genuine care, the walls people build around their pain begin to crack. "More like a long week," he said, his voice rough with emotion. He smoothed the envelope with trembling fingers, and she could now see it was a funeral home letterhead. "My mom," he began, then had to stop to steady his voice. "She passed away 3 days ago in Seattle. It was unexpected, a stroke." He paused, swallowing hard. "I was saving up to visit her next month. Had it all planned out. Funny how life doesn't wait for our plans." The story came out in quiet pieces. He'd been laid off from his job 6 months ago, had been doing odd jobs to make ends meet. When the call came about his mother, he'd spent every last dollar on this plane ticket. He'd slept in his old car at the airport for 2 nights, trying to save enough money for the funeral home payment he carried in the envelope. "Haven't eaten much," he admitted, looking down at the half-eaten snack. "Wanted to make sure I had enough for Mom's arrangements. She always said she wanted a proper goodbye." His voice cracked on the last word, and he quickly wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. The flight attendant noticed how he spoke of his mother in present tense, then caught himself, that painful adjustment everyone makes in the early days of grief. His story wasn't just about hunger or fatigue, it was about a son's love, about maintaining dignity while your world falls apart, about trying to fulfill a final promise to a parent. She learned he had been a bookkeeper for 20 years before the company downsized. "Never thought I'd be in this situation," he said, gesturing vaguely at himself. "Mom was always so proud that I wore a tie to work every day. Now I can barely." He traveled off, but the unfinished sentence hung heavy in the air. What struck her most wasn't just the sadness of his story, but the grace with which he carried it. Here was someone who had hit hard times but still said please and thank you, who apologized for any inconvenience, who tried to maintain his dignity even when circumstances had stripped away so much. The envelope contained exactly $2,472, everything he had been able to scrape together. The funeral home needed $3,000 as a deposit. "They're holding her until tomorrow," he explained, his voice barely audible above the engine noise. "I'm hoping my sister in Seattle might be able to help with the rest, but she's struggling too." As he spoke, the flight attendant noticed how other physical signs she'd observed earlier made sense now. The worn clothes chosen for their professional appearance, the careful way he rationed the snacks, the exhausted alertness of someone carrying a heavy burden alone. His story was still unfolding, but already she knew this wouldn't be just another routine flight. Sometimes, at 35,000 feet, you're reminded that every passenger carries an invisible story, and sometimes those stories break your heart just enough to make you take action. After hearing the passenger's story, the flight attendant felt that familiar flutter in her chest, the feeling that told her she needed to do something. She'd learned long ago that sometimes the smallest actions could change someone's entire world. Without saying another word, she stood up and made her way to the galley, her mind already forming a plan. First, she spoke with her fellow crew members during their brief break. "There's a passenger," she began, and as she shared his story, she watched their expression shift from professional interest to genuine concern. Within minutes, they were pulling their meal vouchers and reaching into their own bags for snacks they'd packed for their layover. "Let me talk to the captain," one of them suggested. In the confined space of an airplane, news travels fast among the crew, but so does compassion. The captain, a veteran pilot with silver hair and kind eyes, listened intently as she explained the situation. Without hesitation, he reached for his own wallet, adding to what the crew had gathered. Back in the galley, she began assembling what she could. The first-class meal service had extra entrees today, a rare blessing. She carefully arranged a proper meal on a clean tray, adding extra snacks and beverages. But she knew food was just the beginning of what this passenger needed. While preparing the tray, she overheard two flight attendants quietly discussing hotel points they could spare. Another was writing something down, contact information for a social services organization in Seattle that helped with funeral expenses. In moments like these, the true spirit of their profession shone through. They weren't just there for safety demonstrations and drink service, but to help people through life's most difficult moments. She picked up a napkin to add to the tray and paused, remembering something from her training years ago. Sometimes people need to know they're not alone more than they need anything else. Taking out her pen, she wrote a simple message: "We're here to help. You're not alone in this." She added it to the tray, tucking it under a warm roll. The passenger was still sitting quietly when she returned, staring out the window at the endless sea of clouds below. She noticed how he'd carefully folded the envelope and placed it in his jacket pocket, close to his heart. As she approached with the tray, his eyes widened in surprise. "I can't accept," he began, but she gently placed the tray on his table. "We take care of our own up here," she said softly. "And right now, you're part of our flight family." The words were simple but genuine, and she saw something shift in his expression. A tiny crack in the wall of isolation grief builds around us. As she arranged the items on his tray, she explained how the crew had come together to help. "There's a meal here, some extra snacks for later, and," she paused, pulling out a small envelope, "we've collected some resources that might help in Seattle." She didn't mention the money they'd gathered. That would come later, handled discreetly. The man stared at the tray, then up at her, his eyes glistening. "I don't know what to say," he whispered. His hands, which had been so tightly clenched before, slowly relaxed. Sometimes gratitude doesn't need words. It shows in the way shoulders lose their tension, in the subtle shift from despair to hope. "You don't need to say anything," she assured him. "Just know that you're not alone in this journey." She noticed how he carefully picked up the napkin with her note, reading it several times before folding it gently and placing it in his pocket alongside his mother's funeral home letter. In the galley, the crew was still quietly organizing additional help. One flight attendant was writing down the contact information for a grief counseling center in Seattle. Another had reached out to the ground crew at their destination, ensuring someone would be there to help him navigate to his next connection. What started as a simple observation, dirt on a passenger's clothes, had transformed into something much bigger. It was a reminder that sometimes the most important part of their job wasn't serving drinks or ensuring safety protocols, but recognizing when someone needed help and having the courage to provide it. Word of the passenger's situation spread through the cabin like a gentle wave. It started with a businessman in first class who noticed the flight attendant's special care with the meal tray. When he quietly asked her about it, she hesitated, protecting the passenger's privacy, but something in the businessman's genuine concern made her share just enough of the story. "I have hotel points," he said immediately, pulling out his laptop. "Enough for 3 nights at any hotel near the airport. Please let me help." His fingers moved quickly over the keyboard, booking a comfortable room where the grieving son could finally rest properly. A young woman sitting across the aisle had overheard fragments of the earlier conversation. She worked for a funeral home in Portland and knew all too well how costs could overwhelm families during their darkest hours. She wrote down contact information for organizations that helped with funeral expenses, then added a personal note about how her own mother's passing had led her to this work. The ripple effect continued. A teacher grading papers in row 18 passed forward a gift card she'd been saving. An elderly couple returning from visiting their grandchildren insisted on sharing the fresh cookies their daughter had packed for their journey. Each small gesture added to something bigger, something more powerful than any single act of kindness. A quiet murmur of compassion moved through the cabin. Not loud or intrusive, people instinctively knew to protect the passenger's dignity. But in whispered conversations and subtle gestures, humanity's better nature emerged at 35,000 feet. An off-duty nurse offered to help him navigate the Seattle airport to his connection. College students studying social work shared information about grief support groups in the Seattle area. Each person found their own way to contribute, using whatever resources or knowledge they had. The flight attendant watched it unfold with quiet amazement. In her years of flying, she'd seen how tragedy could bring out both the worst and best in people. Today, she was witnessing the best, the simple, sincere desire to help a stranger in need. One passenger, a small business owner, quietly asked about the funeral home deposit. When told about the shortfall, he didn't hesitate. "I lost my mom last year," he said softly, passing forward an envelope. "I know what it means to give them a proper goodbye." Inside was enough to cover the remaining balance needed for the deposit. Even those who couldn't contribute financially found ways to help. A writer penned a heartfelt note about losing her own parent, sharing words of comfort that only someone who'd walked that path could offer. A musician traveling to a gig quietly added a card for free grief counseling sessions, his day job when he wasn't performing. The passenger in row 14 remained unaware of much of this activity, lost in his own thoughts and grief. But the flight attendant could see subtle changes in his demeanor. His shoulders weren't quite so hunched, his breathing had steadied, and when she passed by with water, she noticed he was actually drinking it now instead of just holding the cup. What touched her most was how natural it all felt. There was no grand announcement, no public display of charity. Just humans recognizing another human in pain and reaching out in whatever way they could. Some offered resources, others shared their own stories of loss and survival, each contribution a thread in a tapestry of compassion. As the plane continued its journey westward, the cabin had transformed into something more than just a metal tube carrying strangers through the sky. It had become a community, united by the simple desire to ease one person's burden. The flight attendant realized she was witnessing something remarkable, not just acts of kindness, but the restoration of one man's faith in humanity, one small gesture at a time. The story of that flight didn't end when the wheels touched down in Seattle. In many ways, that's where it truly began. As passengers gathered their belongings, there was a different energy in the cabin. The kind that comes from being part of something meaningful, something bigger than themselves. The flight attendant watched as the passenger from row 14 was quietly handed an envelope containing the collected funds, hotel information, and various resources. His hands trembled as he realized what the flight crew and passengers had done. "I don't know how to thank," he began, his voice breaking. The flight attendant simply smiled and said, "Just remember that there's always kindness in the world, even on the hardest days." 2 weeks later, a letter arrived at the airline's corporate office. In it, the passenger shared how that flight had changed more than just his immediate circumstances. The collected funds had not only covered the funeral home deposit, but also helped with other expenses. The hotel room had given him a safe place to rest and grieve. The contact information for support services had connected him with people who could help him navigate his loss. But more than the practical help, he wrote about how that flight had restored his faith in humanity during his darkest hour. "I went into that flight feeling completely alone," he wrote. "I left feeling like I had a whole community behind me." The airline's management was so moved by the story that they decided to create a new training module. Called Compassion at 35,000 feet, it used this flight as an example of how small acts of kindness could make a profound difference. Flight crews across the country began learning about looking beyond the obvious, about recognizing when passengers might need more than just a drink service. The story found its way onto social media, shared not for publicity but as a reminder of our shared humanity. Comments poured in from people who had experienced similar moments of kindness during their own difficult times. Flight attendants from other airlines shared their own stories of passengers helping passengers, of strangers becoming temporary families in the sky. The original flight attendant received a special commendation, but she insisted on sharing it with her entire crew and the passengers who had helped. "This wasn't about one person," she explained. "It was about what happens when people choose to see each other as human beings first." A year later, the passenger returned to flying, this time as a volunteer for an organization that helps people travel to funeral services when they can't afford it. He never forgot how it felt to be seen and helped when he needed it most. In his wallet, he still carried the napkin with the flight attendant's simple message, "You're not alone in this." The airline's corporate culture began to shift, emphasizing not just efficiency and service, but also compassion and awareness. They created an emergency fund for passengers facing similar situations, inspired by that one flight where strangers came together to help someone in need. Other airlines took notice. The story became part of a larger conversation about how air travel, often seen as an impersonal experience, could be transformed into opportunities for human connection. Training programs began including sections on recognizing and responding to passengers in crisis, not just medical emergencies, but emotional ones as well. The flight crew stayed in touch with the passenger, receiving updates as he rebuilt his life. He found a new job, started volunteering at a grief support center, and slowly began to heal. Each step forward, he said, was made possible because a group of strangers on an airplane had shown him that he wasn't alone. Perhaps the most lasting impact wasn't in the policies changed or the programs created, but in the reminder that even in our most automated, disconnected world, human kindness still has the power to transform lives. It proved that sometimes the most important journey isn't the one marked on your boarding pass, but the one that takes place in the heart, at 35,000 feet above the ground.